Hello and welcome to SEL in a virtual world. Today we'll have a short session on the ways in which we can promote social emotional connection and learning even amidst physical distancing. My name is Lindsay Minder and I am a manager of partnerships at Transforming Education. At Transforming Ed, our mission is to partner with school systems to support educators in fostering the development of the whole child so that all students, particularly those from underserved populations, can thrive. We do this in a number of ways through a number of partnerships all across the country. And we're eager to bring to you this first recorded session that can be used by individuals, small groups, whole districts to think about the ways in which to best support the whole child in school settings. So our guiding questions for today are really thinking about how do we support the social emotional development of students and staff, even while we may be physically apart? And what best practices in social emotional learning can we leverage for distance learning? Especially during times like these, but really anytime, it's important to give people an opportunity to settle in physically, mentally, and emotionally before engaging in work. To help ourselves, staff, or students, it's a supportive strategy to take a mindful moment before jumping in. So this example provides how we can use a visual cue to help center ourselves before engaging in the work. So we'll do a 1-minute exercise together to get us started. So now that we're present and here together, we will move into some of our content. So we have 3 big takeaways for today's session. And when we're thinking about SEL for distance learning, we're thinking about 3 major areas: relationships, routines, and reflection. And today we'll dive into each of those a little bit more. One of the things we want to point out is now is not a time to forget all of the best practices that you're already using in schools and classroom settings. As one school leader said, school buildings may be closed, but school is so much more than just the building. Many elements of an integrated SEL approach can still happen virtually. It might just look a bit different. So don't forget what you already know. Best practices in trauma-informed and healing-centered work within the school building is still, and even more so, crucial in a virtual or hybrid environment. These 3 areas related to our integration approach, and they're also related to recommendations from the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network. You'll notice they're also similar to the guidelines put out from Turnaround for Children with Dr. Pamela Cantor. Again, showing that these best practices for SEL really do translate across environments. So first, we'll dive in a little bit to thinking about relationships. So as we all know, the power of relationships is huge. Research shows that the presence of one strong, stable, supportive adult can be a mitigating factor to the impact of adverse childhood experiences, stress, and trauma. It is the presence of a supportive relationship that can keep highly stressful events and experiences in the tolerable versus the toxic stress zone. Matthew Lieberman from UCLA, who is a neuroscience researcher, argues that social connections are as basic of a need as food, water, and shelter when we think about Maslow's hierarchy. So we must consider all relationships at this time, not just students and staff. And one of the things I want to point out here that this quote really brings to the forefront is one of the reasons many people go into education is for the joy and the fun that comes from working with students and colleagues in that school environment. And that's a really important piece to maintain and capitalize even in these different times. So when we think about relationships, we're thinking about 4 different types of relationships to really focus on. And this goes beyond just the student to staff relationship. So it's important to start there though, and then kind of extrapolate out. So when we think about the staff to student relationship, we want to think about students with the weakest link to staff may be the first to lose connection. So we want to double down on those relationships, but also make sure that all students feel connected. So using a resource or an activity like relationship mapping or banking time virtually through one of these planning docs can help to track those connections and information. So it's critical that these opportunities to reach out and check in with students aren't just sort of ad hoc and one-off, but really intentional and documented so that you can note some of the patterns in who is getting check-ins, what patterns we're seeing, who we're not hearing from, all of those sorts of things. In terms of staff to student relationships, it's also important to think about the way we can continue to leverage existing practices from the classroom that we use to build and maintain relationships in a virtual or hybrid world. So simple activities like morning messages are critical to help students feel welcomed and informed about what's about to happen, and those can continue virtually. Additionally, the use of read alouds as a way to build connections, engage in conversations, or questions of problems of the day that are a very typical activity in sort of an entrance ticket or do now format. And those are things that we can continue to use and leverage relationships in this time. It's also important to consider those student-to-student interactions. We all know the benefit of collaborative, team-based work in the classroom setting, and now is a time to get a little more creative in how to create those collaborative assignments and experiences in this virtual or hybrid world. So think about ways that students can engage in interactive elements through online platforms, and you can maintain some of those relationship building components that are typically part of the classroom setting through virtual crew or advisory. So there's still that time for connection and relationship building. We also want to think about ways to support staff to staff relationships. We all know that a huge part of being able to maintain our best practices and stay engaged in the work is those relationships with supportive colleagues. And so it's important to consider the ways in which those relationships may look very different, but can still be promoted and even expanded upon in a virtual or hybrid world. So there's a stakeholder engagement map here that follows a very similar thought process to the relationship mapping activity for students, but thinking about what staff members are being checked in with in what ways and what are we learning from check-ins with those. So whether you are a school leader or a team leader, thinking about the ways that we can be equitable in checking in with all staff. Also, being able to support and in a friendly way, hold each other accountable for different self-care practices and routines. Having an accountability buddy in some of those areas can be a great way to remind yourself and remind your colleagues about the importance of self-care during this time. And lastly, a deeper practice that people can engage in, even in a virtual environment, over phone or a Zoom meeting, is empathy interviews and taking time to really listen actively and reflectively and internalize the experiences of others during this time. The last category of relationships that we cannot forget is the student to family. Many students have been and will continue to be spending more time around their family during the hours which they are typically out of the house in the school building. And so this is a time that we can really support and bolster that student to family relationship when it comes to interacting around academic content and school projects. So here are a few examples of some projects and resources that can support engaging students with their families in their learning from the home environment. So as we think about relationships, a few other things I just want to point out is that messages unanswered does not equate to messages not received. So although we may be reaching out to staff and students and families and not hearing back, that doesn't mean that the message was not received. And so it's really important to not feel disheartened or disappointed and overwhelmed by lack of responses, but also just keep in mind that oftentimes, as we all do, we check an email, we see a text message, we internalize it, and we don't necessarily respond. So don't use lack of responses as a reason to stop trying to maintain some of those connections. And then I also, again, just want to reiterate that stressed and overwhelmed staff often lead to stressed and overwhelmed students. So this is why it's really critical to support the staff-to-staff relationships and really create that supportive environment so that they can be best available to support students in their ongoing relationships. So our next focus area is routines. And we all know that the supportive and successful environments in schools are constantly striking a balance between consistency and flexibility and predictability and adaptability. And so it's kind of this constant balancing act of how can we maintain a safe and supportive structure while also giving time for staff and student voice and choice, that individualization, that differentiation, and that adaptability. And so research shows that students thrive in conditions that have clear, established boundaries, guidelines, routines, and structures. That consistency and predictability leads to trust, and students feel safe when they know what to expect. Uncertainty and unexpected change can fuel stress, anxiety, and fear. And at this time, when there's a great deal out of students' control, it's important to provide consistent and stable support whenever possible. Conversely, it's also important to acknowledge and embrace the uncertainty as best we can. Things look different than they always have. Teachers are being asked to teach and students are being asked to learn in ways that they have never tried before. So we must meet these shifts with grace and understanding. And so to think a little bit about routines, we want to think about the areas in which we can remain predictable and consistent and the areas in which we need to sort of embrace that flexibility and adaptability. So one area to just start around the predictability consistency is to try to recreate elements of the classroom and school environment, starting with some of the most simple things, like the flow of an individual lesson. How does it typically start? What happens in the middle? How does it end? And how can we recreate some of those structures of the scheduling elements of an individual lesson or a school day? Thinking about how both for ourselves working from home and also for students, we can think about recreating elements of the learning space. What resources or visuals can they have around that feels that it is supporting a similar learning space to their classroom environment? Also, rituals and celebrations that are typically part of a classroom day, whether it's a greeting at the door or a certain mantra or chant that a class does, bringing those into the virtual environment as well. And here are linked some resources that have checklists and planners for thinking about how to create some of these routines in the home environment. It's also important, both from a educator to student perspective, but also a school leader to staff perspective, is being very clear to communicate plans around routines or expectations that may be shifting, such as communication, grading, and assignments. So many things may look different, but if there is a plan for that, be clear to communicate that plan. So again, people have the support of the known in a time when so much is unknown. And then, of course, there's also a necessity to embrace flexibility and adaptability. And so in order to decrease stress, one of the simplest things we can do for students is modify assignments in ways that best fit their needs. So thinking about which elements of an assignment can be shifted and adapted to this new environment. Also thinking about the ways in which we can increase joy, levity, humor, and fun in assignments, getting a little bit more creative in some of the ways that maybe it always felt like we didn't, quote unquote, have time to in the classroom setting, bringing some of those elements of joy and levity into the learning experience. And then from both the educator and the leader perspective, considering what were previous must-dos that now could be can-dos, whether it's attendance in full hour-long PDs and staff meetings, whether it's certain hours of work time on or off, whether it is deadlines for assignments or time limits for assessments, thinking about what shifts can be made to best support the new routines and environments that are happening for so many. And the last section that we'll consider is reflection. And so oftentimes within the classroom environment, we build in time to synthesize learning with students, for students and ourselves as educators to reflect on what has happened in a learning experience to then inform future experiences. And this type of reflection and other types are incredibly critical in this time. So reflection can be both an introspective and an interpersonal experience. We can reflect independently or we can reflect in community. And oftentimes this is an important area in which we are able to model for students to really sort of bolster their skill set and their comfort with engaging in some reflective practices. So the first area we'll consider is the importance of discussing emotions. So it's important to model the naming and normalizing of emotions, especially in a time when there are many different emotions happening for any different individual. So some students and staff may feel happy that school looks very different. Others may be scared, sad, or overwhelmed. And so this is really important to consider the similarities that many of us might experience prior to students going on a long winter break or a summer vacation. You have some students who are incredibly excited to have time away and time off, and you have other students who really wish they were just continuing to come to school because of that predictability and the consistency where they know what to expect. And so leaving space and normalizing all those emotions is really important for students. Recognizing and naming emotions is a fundamental skill that right now there are many authentic opportunities to practice. And so we want to use language and visuals that we've already established in classroom settings when possible to continue to support students with checking in with how they're feeling emotionally and how they're responding to these feelings. And again, in terms of the routines and the predictability, if you have certain visuals or practices that you typically use in the classroom setting, be it the mood meter or zones of regulation or a morning check-in around feelings, it is great to continue those same practices, but increase the frequency during this time when discussing emotions is really critical. Another reflective practice that we can continue to promote in this virtual or hybrid environment is mindfulness practices. Whether it's working with students around very simple acronyms like RAIN, HALT, STOP, and SNACK, or developing deeper practices, it's crucial that we support students and colleagues in taking time to examine the way we are thinking, feeling, acting in any given moment without a lens of judgment. And that's really the mindfulness practice that's critical in this time. So these simple acronyms, for example, can be placed on a Post-it note, right on a student or staff member's Chromebook or laptop. They can be placed on a desk, wherever the case may be, as a simple visual cue to engage in some sort of mindfulness practice. Be it, for example, RAIN encourages us to recognize, allow, investigate, and not attach to whatever experience we're having in that moment. HALT is another example that when strong emotions come up, we can be reminded to ask ourselves, am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I lonely? Am I tired? Again, these simple reflective practices can help individuals sort of check in with where they are and plan for where they might need to go next. Another mindfulness practice that we can support is a compassion practice. During a time when many people want to be supportive in a number of different ways, but we may be limited in how to do that, a compassion practice can support in sending kindness and compassion to those in need, and it can really facilitate this sense of support when many people are feeling helpless or unsure what to do. Body scans are another practice that can help students and staff recognize where and how feelings are being held in our bodies, really sort of making that link between the emotional and intellectual experience and the physical experience that happens in the body. And all of these things can be supported through a number of free or very low cost apps that are being offered right now for a number of students and educators. And the last reflective practice I want to highlight is the practice of journaling. And this is a great way to engage students in a more introspective way to do some reflecting. It also provides an academic activity that directly supports social emotional learning. And in that, I mean, students can be engaged in a writing assignment that is also directly supporting their growth in terms of their social and emotional competencies. So some journaling activities can include a gratitude practice. Science shows numerous benefits emotionally and physically to engaging in gratitude practices. And so this is a way students can express gratitude to strengthen relationships and also increase their happiness. Again, this can be something that is shared with others or is not shared, depending on sort of your intentions around the practice. 5-minute journals are also a great way to have students engage in very bite-sized reflective activities with simple prompts such as I am grateful for, what would make today great, a daily affirmation, and then at the end of the day, another similar 5-minute reflection of just what are 3 amazing things that happened, how could I have made today better? These sorts of reflections to plan for and then bookend the day for a student or, again, a staff member. And so to review, when we consider social emotional learning in a distance learning environment, we have these 3 categories to really lean into: relationships, routines, and reflection. Again, nothing brand new, continued best practices from the classroom setting, from the school setting that we want to bring into a virtual or hybrid world. So before we close out, considering relationships, routines, and reflections, take a moment to jot down on a sticky note nearby you or close your eyes and visualize in your mind. What is one bright spot and one challenge you experienced this past spring around relationships, routines, and reflection? One bright spot and one challenge. And now that you've taken that time to think of some of the positives, but also maybe some of the challenges, what was something you learned during the past spring that you would like to bring into the fall? even without knowing exactly what the fall might look like, what have you learned from the experiences in the spring that you would like to bring into the fall, considering relationships, routines, and reflection? And lastly, what are you currently thinking of trying when it comes to SEL this fall? When thinking about the social emotional learning of students and staff in your school sphere, what are you thinking of trying this fall? And so, whether you just mentally engaged in that reflection exercise or actually jotted some things down, revisit these ideas in the midst of planning and thinking through future experiences with staff and students, because these are three key areas that their importance is not going to go away. So continuing to come back to relationships, routines, and reflections will continue to embed this social emotional component into all learning experiences, whatever they might look like. And so before closing out, we just want to highlight that we've also included some ways in which you can integrate more explicit instruction around social emotional learning for students. So we're often used to, in the school building or the classroom setting, doing some level of direct instruction around social emotional competencies, how students are engaging with their emotions, how students are responding to conflict, how they're building relationships, all of these different things. And those opportunities might not look the same in a virtual world. And so here are some ways that students can engage in more of that learning to develop their skill sets and practice. And we've also included some additional resources that are student focused, staff focused, and family focused that really dive a bit deeper into the ways in which we can consider social emotional learning in a distance learning world. And we at Transforming Education want you to know that we are here for you to support this work now and into the future. So you can access our newsletters, toolkits, or downloadable papers at our website at transformingeducation.org. You can also follow us on Twitter, where we consistently post a number of resources and connect to a number of other amazing organizations. Or you could email me directly at lindsay@transformingeducation.org for more information about any of the resources or the ideas that we presented here. So we hope this gives you a snapshot into the ways in which we can intentionally and authentically bring social emotional learning into a distance learning world. And although students and staff may be physically apart, thinking about the ways that we can really maintain and bolster social connection during this time. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you have some clear takeaways from this, and we look forward to sharing more resources with you soon. Be well.